She was already dead. That's what they told him. That's what every reasonable man in Hatcher's Creek believed. But Colton Mercer had never been a reasonable man. A blizzard had swallowed the Colorado Rockies whole. Visibility was zero. Temperatures had dropped to levels that killed cattle where they stood. And somewhere out in that white, merciless silence was a woman he had never touched, never seen in person, only known through letters that smelled faintly of lavender and ink. A woman who had crossed half a continent to marry him. A woman who was now simply gone. He could have stayed warm. He could have waited. He could have listened. Instead, Colton Mercer saddled his horse in the dark. If you've ever wondered what it takes to ride into a blizzard for someone you've never met, stay with me until the end of this story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach rolled into Hatcher's Creek 40 minutes late, which in November meant it arrived in near darkness. The horses lathered and blowing clouds of steam into air that had already gone bitter with cold. Colton Mercer stood at the edge of the wooden platform outside Haverford's general store, hat pulled low, coat buttoned to the chin. He'd been standing there for the better part of an hour. The cold had worked its way through his boots a long time ago. He didn't move. He was watching the door of the stagecoach. People climbed out. A traveling merchant with 2 leather cases strapped together with rope. An older woman in a black wool coat who looked like she'd swallowed something sour. A young man who couldn't have been more than 17, blinking at the town like he'd expected something bigger. Colton counted them. 3. He walked to the driver, a heavy-set man named Gus Dolliver, who'd been running this route for 11 years. Gus. The driver was already climbing down from the box, moving stiffly, his fingers wrapped around the brake handle like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Colton. He didn't meet his eyes. I'm waiting on a passenger, woman traveling from St. Louis. Name of Hartwell. Gus pulled off one glove with his teeth, tucked it under his arm, and rubbed the back of his neck with his bare hand. It was a gesture Colton recognized, the kind a man made when he was deciding how to say something he didn't want to say. Got a letter for you, Gus said finally. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a folded envelope, corners bent, the wax seal broken and repressed. Come off the relay station at Grover's Pass. Colton took it. He didn't open it yet. Where is she, Gus? The driver finally looked at him. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the road. Coach she was riding hit trouble east of the pass, 3 days back. Wheel gave out on the descent, caught ice wrong. They're saying it tipped. He cleared his throat. Passengers made it to a shelter cabin. That's where your letter comes from. But when the relay riders got there 2 days later to check, he stopped. Say it. She was gone, Colton. Cabin was empty. Her bag was still there. Her coat was gone. Nobody saw which direction she walked. The cold that moved through Colton Mercer then had nothing to do with the temperature. He opened the letter. The handwriting was hers. He'd learned it over 8 months of correspondence. Neat, careful script that leaned slightly to the right. The capital E's in her name looping just a little wider than the rest. Her letters always smelled like the paper itself. No perfume, just clean ink. Mr. Mercer, I am writing this from a shelter cabin somewhere east of Grover's Pass, where our coach tipped 2 days ago. I am uninjured, only cold and frightened, and feeling rather foolish for not packing warmer stockings. The other passengers are here with me. A relay rider came through this morning and has agreed to carry this letter forward. The driver believes it may be 2 more days before help can reach us from town. I don't know if the weather will hold. I want you to know that I am not afraid. Or rather, I am afraid, but I intend to do what I came here to do regardless. I did not travel 1,100 miles to be stopped by ice and bad luck. I will reach Hatcher's Creek. Please don't worry about me. I have a tendency to land on my feet. Yours, Evelyn Hartwell. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his coat, against his chest. The relay riders, he said. They say which direction her tracks went? Gus shook his head. Wind had been blowing all night. Nothing to read by morning. He paused. Sheriff Brandt's been notified. He's saying they'll send a search party when the weather opens up. Could be a week, maybe 2. A week, Colton said it flatly. There's another storm coming. Everybody knows it. You ride out there now, you're asking to get yourself killed alongside... Gus caught himself. Alongside the situation, Colton looked at the mountains. To the east, where the peaks rose up black and jagged against the last gray light of the sky, the clouds were already building. Even from here, he could see them piling on top of each other, dense and purple-bottomed, the kind of clouds that meant serious business. "My son's at the ranch," Colton said. It wasn't a question. He was thinking out loud. "Ruth Calloway's been watching him since this morning," Gus said. Colton had asked her before he rode into town, just in case. "She'll keep him as long as you need." Colton turned back toward where he'd tied his horse. "Colton." Gus's voice had something in it now. Not quite an argument, but close. "I've known you 12 years. You're not a stupid man. You understand what I'm telling you about that storm." "I hear you." "Then act like it." Colton untied his horse. The animal stamped once, impatient, breath rising in plumes. "She wrote that she intended to reach Hatcher's Creek," he said. "I'm going to make sure she does." He mounted up and rode east before Gus could say another word. He stopped at the ranch long enough to change horses. Took his strongest animal, a big dark roan named Porter that he'd used for mountain work before, and to pack what he needed. He moved fast. He didn't let himself think too hard about what he was doing, because thinking too hard about it would lead to the same conclusion Gus had arrived at, and he couldn't afford that conclusion right now. He packed 2 extra wool blankets, a small canvas tarp, dried meat, hardtack, a tin of matches, a flask of whiskey he'd been saving for winter sickness, and his medical kit, thread and needle, bandages, a bottle of carbolic acid he'd bought from the doctor in town on a trip earlier that fall, back when he'd just been a man planning a wedding and trying to be sensible about it. He paused at the door of the house. Wyatt was 7 years old. He was asleep in Ruth Calloway's spare room, which was 3 miles down the road. Colton had already checked on him before coming back to the ranch. The boy hadn't woken. He'd looked small in the borrowed bed, one arm thrown over his face, the way he slept when he was tired enough not to care about anything. Colton had stood in the doorway for a full minute just looking at him. He almost didn't go. That was the honest truth of it. He stood there in the doorway of a neighbor's house with the cold air coming off his coat, looking at his sleeping son, and felt the pull of it, staying, being sensible, letting the sheriff handle what the sheriff handled. But then he thought about a woman sitting in a shelter cabin somewhere in the dark, writing a letter on her lap, telling him she wasn't afraid, telling him she had a tendency to land on her feet, writing it like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. He left a note for Wyatt with Ruth. It said, "I'll be back in a few days. Mind Ruth. Don't give her trouble about the vegetables. Short, practical." The only kind of note he knew how to write. The road east from Hatcher's Creek ran decent for about 4 miles before it started climbing. After that, it became something that was only a road because people insisted on calling it one. A frozen track through timber that narrowed and twisted and eventually disappeared altogether above the tree line, replaced by nothing but snow and instinct and whatever you remembered from the last time you'd been up this way. Colton had been up this way twice before. Once in summer, once in fall. Never in winter, because no reasonable person went into those mountains in winter unless they had no other choice. He rode through the night. The cold was extraordinary. Not the cold of a December evening back east, the kind people romanticized in stories. This was a working cold, a cold that had intentions. It came through the gaps between his collar and his hat. It found the places where his coat was thin at the elbows. His fingers, even in heavy gloves, went numb after the first hour and then settled into a deep, radiating ache that was somehow worse than numbness. Porter moved steady beneath him. The roan was a sensible horse, not fast, but built for elevation, with wide hooves and a temperament that didn't lean toward panic. In the dark, with the wind picking up from the northwest, that steadiness was worth more than anything. Around midnight, it started to snow. Not the light, decorative snow of early winter. This was the real thing. Heavy, horizontal, driven by a wind that wanted to push you off your horse if you gave it half a chance. Colton leaned forward and kept his eyes on the ground in front of Porter's feet, watching for ice patches, for the subtle change in the snow's surface that meant a drop-off below. He moved slow. He moved careful. He stopped twice to let Porter rest and drink from a stream he found where the ice was thin enough to break. He ate a little of the hardtack without dismounting. He did not stop to sleep. By the time gray light began to filter through the clouds, he was above the tree line. The wind had died down somewhat, not calmed, just paused, the way a storm sometimes does before it decides to get serious. The landscape around him was white in every direction, broken only by the dark shapes of rock formations and the occasional skeletal shape of a scrub pine that had survived up here against all reasonable expectations. It took him another hour to find the wreck of the stagecoach. It had tipped on a steep section of the descent, just like Gus had said. The coach was still there, lying on its side against a boulder, one wheel pointing uselessly at the sky. Snow had drifted around it in the night, softening its edges, making it look almost peaceful from a distance, like something that had simply decided to lie down and rest. Up close it was a different story. The door hung open. One of the side panels had cracked through. Personal items were scattered in the snow nearby. A leather bag split at the seams, papers that had frozen flat against the surface. A single woman's boot sitting upright in the snow, as though waiting for its owner to come back for it. Colton dismounted and crouched beside the boot. It was small, narrow. The leather was good quality, not cheap frontier goods. The kind of boot a woman from St. Louis would own. The kind that was suitable for city streets but not for mountain terrain. He set it down carefully and looked around. The shelter cabin was about 300 yards east, set back from the trail against a rock face that offered some protection from the wind. He walked to it with Porter following behind on the lead rope. The door was unlocked. Inside, a cast iron stove, cold, a wooden bench along one wall, a rough table, and against the far wall a traveling bag, dark brown leather, initials stamped in the corner, E.H. He picked it up. Inside, 2 dresses folded with care, a hairbrush, a small book, Jane Eyre, the cover worn at the corners, and at the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief, a small photograph. A young woman, maybe 22 or 23, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was harder to read than most. Not smiling, photographs took too long for that, but not stiff either. There was something in her eyes that looked like she was paying attention to something just off to the side of the lens, something that had caught her interest. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back. Her coat was gone. Her bag was here. She'd left in a hurry, or she'd left without thinking she'd be gone long. Or she'd left knowing exactly what she was doing and decided the bag would slow her down. He stood in the cabin and thought about that letter. I did not travel 1,100 miles to be stopped by ice and bad luck. I will reach Hatcher's Creek. She'd walked. She'd actually gotten up and walked out into the mountain winter alone, heading toward a town she'd never seen, toward a man she'd never met, because she had made a decision and she was going to see it through. Colton went back outside and looked west. The tracks were mostly gone. The overnight snow had seen to that, but not completely. In a sheltered stretch between 2 rock formations, where the wind hadn't reached as well, he could still make out the faint depression of footprints. Small, moving west, moving toward Hatcher's Creek. He mounted up and followed them. The tracks led him along the ridgeline for about 2 miles before dropping back into the timber below. He lost them twice, once on a section of exposed rock where snow hadn't stuck, once where a drift had swallowed them entirely, and both times he stopped, dismounted, walked in slow expanding circles until he picked up the trail again. The second storm front was coming. He could feel it in the air, a change in pressure, a deepening of the cold, the particular quality of silence that meant the wind was gathering itself before the next assault. He'd grown up in mountain country. He knew how much time he had. Not much. He pushed Porter faster, which wasn't fast. The terrain didn't allow for fast, but faster than careful, which was its own kind of risk. The roan slipped once on a hidden ice patch, and Colton grabbed the saddle horn hard, felt the animal scramble and find its footing again. His heart was going when they came back to level ground. Easy, he said. To the horse or to himself? He wasn't entirely sure. The light was going bad. The clouds had moved in during the last hour, dropping the ceiling lower, turning the afternoon gray and flat. In this kind of light, in this kind of terrain, the distance between daylight and genuine darkness was shorter than it should have been. He had maybe 2 hours. Maybe less. He almost missed her. The field opened up without warning. A broad, flat section where the timber thinned and the snow lay undisturbed in all directions. He was looking left, following the line of the trees, when Porter shied sideways and Colton yanked his gaze forward. 50 yards ahead. A dark shape in the snow. He was off the horse before he'd fully registered what he was seeing, running, or trying to run, which in snow that depth is more like lurching, with Porter's reins in one hand and the other reaching forward like he could cover the distance faster with intention than with legs. She was face down. He dropped to his knees beside her and got a hand on her shoulder, rolled her carefully. She was breathing. He could see it. The faint rise and fall beneath a coat that was nowhere near heavy enough for what she'd put it through. Her lips had gone blue at the edges. Her face was pale in a way that was not natural. But she was breathing. Hey. He didn't know what else to say. He cupped her face in both hands, which were not warm, but were warmer than the ground she'd been lying on. Hey, I need you to wake up. Nothing. Evelyn. He said her name for the first time. It felt strange, saying it out loud, the name he'd written at the top of letters for 8 months. Evelyn, I need you to open your eyes. Her eyes opened. They were dark brown, which he hadn't expected. The photograph hadn't told him that. And for a moment she just looked at him with an expression that was somewhere between bewilderment and intense focus, like she was trying to work out a complicated problem. You're not a bear, she said. Her voice was thick, slurred at the edges. Not a good sign. No, he agreed. I'm not a bear. I thought... She stopped, tried to push herself up and couldn't manage it. Her arms shook with the effort. I thought I heard something and I... You need to stop moving, Colton said. He was already assessing. Fingers, ears, the color in her face, the way her hands fell when they dropped. Can you feel your feet? She blinked. Yes. They hurt. Good. Hurting means blood's still moving. He looked around the field. The wind was picking up again. There's a line shack about half a mile back down the east slope. Can you ride? I can ride. She said it with more certainty than her body appeared to support. All right. He stood and brought Porter alongside, then crouched again. I'm going to help you up. You're going to hold the saddle horn with both hands and not let go. You understand? Yes. She met his eyes. You're Colton Mercer. I am. She looked at him for another moment, still doing that assessing thing, still trying to work something out. Then she put her hand on his shoulder and let him help her stand. She didn't pass out on the ride, which he counted as a significant victory. She swayed twice, badly, and each time he reached back and steadied her without comment, and she righted herself without making a sound about it. The line shack was there where he remembered it. A low structure built into the hillside used by the ranch hands from the Dunnigan operation when they were running cattle up high in the summer. The door hadn't been locked in years. Inside, bare wood walls, a small iron stove, a pile of old wood that had been sitting there since fall and had stayed dry thanks to the low roof. A rough cot with a straw tick mattress that had seen better days sometime around 1870. Colton sat Evelyn on the cot and got the stove going. His hands were barely working at this point. The ride hadn't done his fingers any favors. And it took him 4 matches and more time than it should have to get the fire caught. When it finally took, the relief was immediate and physical. He turned back to her. She was sitting with her hands clasped in her lap, watching him with that same concentrated attention she'd had when she opened her eyes in the snow. She'd stopped shivering, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. He moved to her immediately. Your hands, he said, sitting beside her on the cot. He took both her hands in his, felt how cold they were. Not dead cold, not white. That was something. Look at me. She looked at him. I need to get your boots off and check your feet. I know, but I need to. I understand, she said. No argument, no embarrassment about it, or if there was embarrassment, she put it somewhere else. Do what you need to do. He worked carefully. Her feet were in better shape than he'd feared. The boots had actually protected them. Expensive boots doing the one job they were built for. 2 toes on her left foot had gone a bad color. He rubbed them between his palms, slow and steady, until some pink came back, until she hissed through her teeth at the returning sensation, which meant the nerves were working. That hurts, she said conversationally, like she was reporting weather. I know. Keep still. I'm not moving. I know you're not. He kept working. You've been walking since this morning? Since before light. She shifted slightly. I calculated the distance from where the driver told us we were, and I thought I could make it. I had a map. It looked manageable on paper. Most things do. A pause. Yes, that's a fair point. He wrapped both feet in the cleanest bandage cloth he had, which wasn't very clean but was dry, and then he put his spare pair of wool socks over that, stretching them over the bandages. Then he tucked both her feet under the edge of one of the wool blankets he'd packed. Drink this. He handed her the flask. She opened it, smelled it, and didn't make a face about it the way some people did. She took one deliberate swallow, handed it back. Thank you. He sat back on the cot's edge and looked at the fire for a moment. It was going well now, the stove ticking and popping as the iron expanded. The shack was starting to warm, barely, just enough to matter. How did you find me? She asked. Tracked you from the cabin, mostly. Mostly? Lost the tracks twice. Had to search. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had found the shack and was feeling around the edges of it, looking for weaknesses. The storm was coming in now for real. You rode out in this, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. They told you not to. Someone told you not to. Gus Dolliver, the stage driver. He glanced at her. He was pretty clear about it. Evelyn looked at her hands in her lap. I wrote you a letter from the cabin. I said not to worry. I read it. Then you knew I was probably all right. You said you had a tendency to land on your feet. I do, she said, and then seemed to hear the problem with that sentence given the current circumstances. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. Usually, he agreed. The fire snapped. Somewhere above them, the storm was making itself known against the roof, a low, steady drumming that would have been miserable if it hadn't also meant they were inside and not outside. I didn't know what you looked like, he said, after a while. Only the photograph. Same for me. She looked at him directly. She'd been doing that, measuring him, he thought, deciding something. You're taller than I expected. You're more stubborn than your letters suggested. Something flickered in her expression. My letters were entirely honest. Your letters were careful. He met her eyes. There's a difference. She held his gaze for a long moment. Not hostile, something more complicated than that, like she was recalculating. I suppose that's fair, she said finally. He stood and moved to the stove, added another piece of wood. His back was to her, and he thought about the 8 months of letters. He'd been careful in his own way, telling her the truth about the ranch, about Wyatt, about the winters, about what life out here actually was, because he'd heard enough stories about women who'd come west thinking they were signing up for one thing and arrived to find another. He'd been honest about the hardship, but he hadn't been honest about all of it. He hadn't told her, for instance, that he still didn't entirely understand why she was coming, a young woman from St. Louis with some education and apparently her whole life ahead of her. He hadn't asked, because asking felt like something he wasn't supposed to ask. You should sleep, he said. We'll head out at first light, if the storm breaks. And if it doesn't, then we wait. He turned back to look at her. She was leaning against the wall behind the cot, the blanket pulled up to her chin, still watching him with those attentive eyes. The shack will hold. We've got enough wood for 2 days and food enough for longer than that. Your son, she said. Wyatt. He's at a neighbor's place. He's fine. How old is he? 7. He sat down on the wooden floor near the stove, back against the wall. He stopped. Started again. His mother died 4 years ago. Fever. He said it plainly, the way you said the things that had been said so many times they'd worn down to just the facts of them. He's a good kid, quiet, smart, doesn't trust new people easily. Evelyn absorbed this without rushing past it. Neither do I, she said. Trust new people easily. He looked at her. My mother thought it was a defect, she continued. She said a woman who didn't make friends quickly would find herself alone. I told her I'd rather be alone than surrounded by people I couldn't trust. She paused. She didn't find that comforting. No, Colton said. I imagine not. She also didn't understand why I was coming here. Evelyn was looking at the stove now, at the small orange glow visible through the damper slot. She listed every reason it was unreasonable. The distance, the climate, the fact that I didn't know you, the fact that… She stopped. A long list. She wasn't wrong about some of it. No. She looked back at him. But she wasn't right about the part that mattered. What part was that? The wind hit the shack hard, a gust that rattled the door in its frame and sent a draft across the floor. Neither of them moved. That I'd be miserable, Evelyn said. She was certain I would be miserable. That I'd come here and find nothing but cold and hard work and regret it within a year. Colton said nothing. He was watching her face. I've been cold before, she said. Not like this, but some version of it. She paused. I worked in a textile office in St. Louis for 2 years after my father died. I sat at the same desk every day and did the same work and went home to the same rooms, and there was nothing wrong with any of it. It was perfectly adequate. She said the words like they had weight in them. I don't want perfectly adequate. Colton thought about the ranch. He thought about the particular quality of silence on a clear winter morning when the snow was fresh and the mountains were visible from the kitchen window. He thought about Wyatt eating breakfast with one hand while reading something under the table, thinking he wasn't being noticed. I can't promise you it'll be anything more than hard, he said. The ranch is in decent shape, but decent shape in this country means something different than it does elsewhere. The winters are serious. The summers aren't much of a relief. I know, she said. You told me, in your letters. I know I told you. I want to make sure you heard it. Mr. Mercer. Her voice had a quality to it now. Still calm, still measured, but something else underneath. Something with an edge. I left a city, a job, my family, and every comfortable thing I owned and traveled 1,100 miles in a stagecoach that subsequently tipped over and left me alone on a mountain in November. I have heard everything you told me. A beat. And I have heard everything you didn't tell me as well. He was quiet for a moment. What do you think I didn't tell you? That you're afraid this won't work. She said it without cruelty. Just observation. That you're afraid I'll come and find it worse than I expected, or that your son won't take to me, or that something will go wrong. That's what's underneath all the practical warnings. You were trying to give me reasons to say no while technically asking me to say yes. The fire popped. Colton looked at the floor. You're not wrong, he said finally. I know. That doesn't bother you? Which part? She asked. That you're afraid or that you tried to warn me off? Either. Evelyn shifted on the cot. Her eyes were heavy now, exhaustion claiming her despite the conversation. People who aren't afraid of anything have never been in situations that mattered, she said. I'd be more worried if you weren't afraid. A pause. And as for the other part, I read between the lines. I read all your letters very carefully, Mr. Mercer. I know what I agreed to. He looked at her. She looked back at him, barely, eyelids dropping. You should sleep, he said again. This time, she didn't argue. He sat by the stove through most of the night. He fed it wood every hour or so, kept the temperature in the shack just above something survivable. He checked on her twice, just to confirm she was breathing steady, that her color was coming back, that the night wasn't taking something away from her that the afternoon hadn't finished. Both times, she was sleeping so completely that she didn't stir. Around 3 a.m, the storm outside reached what felt like its peak. The walls trembled. The roof made sounds that were not entirely reassuring, and Porter, tied to the side of the shack with enough shelter from the overhang, stamped and shifted but held. Colton added wood and waited. He thought about Wyatt, who was sleeping warm 3 miles from town with Ruth Calloway, who made terrible coffee but was the most dependable person in Hatcher's Creek. He thought about the letter he'd left. Mind Ruth. Don't give her trouble about the vegetables. Wyatt had a particular and principled objection to root vegetables that had been a minor but ongoing negotiation for most of his life. He thought about the woman sleeping on the cot. The photograph he'd looked at for 8 months hadn't prepared him for the reality of her, which was more present than a photograph. That was the only way he could think of it. She was more there than he'd expected, more sharp, more watchful. He'd read the letter so many times he'd built something in his mind, some version of Evelyn Hartwell made of words, and the actual woman was similar to it in all the ways that mattered and entirely different in ways he didn't have language for yet. She'd said, I know what I agreed to. He hoped that was true. He hoped it all the way to his bones, in the way you hoped for things that you understood were not entirely in your control. The storm broke some time before dawn. The drumming on the roof eased and then stopped. In the sudden silence, the shack felt different, smaller somehow, more real. Colton stood and went to the door and opened it a crack. The sky was beginning to go gray in the east. The snow had stopped. The air was still brutally cold, colder than before, in fact, the way it always got colder once a storm finished, but clear. He could see stars at the edge of the cloud bank, small and hard and very far away. Porter lifted his head and looked at him from under the overhang. "We're going soon," Colton told the horse. He went back inside and crouched beside the stove. He let her sleep another hour. When the sky had gone from gray to the pale, colorless light of early winter morning, he crossed to the cot and laid a hand gently on her shoulder. She was awake before he touched her. He could see it in the change in her breathing. "It's morning," he said. "Storm's done. We need to move." She sat up. Her hair had come loose from its pins while she slept and was falling around her shoulders, dark and disordered. She didn't seem particularly concerned about it. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who'd already cataloged where she was and what was happening before she'd fully risen to consciousness. "My feet," she said. "Try standing." She stood, tested her weight. Winced once, controlled it immediately, put her weight down more deliberately. "That'll do," she said. "It's 4 hours' ride to town in decent conditions." He handed her a strip of dried meat and a piece of hardtack. "Eat this. It's not good." "I'm sure it's fine." "It isn't. Eat it anyway." She did, without flinching about it, washing it down with a small amount of water from his canteen. He ate the same, standing by the stove's last warmth. "I want my bag," she said. "I know. It's at the shelter cabin. We'll go past it on the way down." She nodded, once decisive. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her. "Thank you for coming." She said it directly, without performance. "I know what it costs to ride out in that. I won't pretend I don't." He didn't know what to do with it, exactly. The gratitude, the directness, the fact that she'd said, "I won't pretend." He wasn't used to people who said what they meant without building a frame around it first. "You would have done the same," he said, if the situation was reversed. She considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think I would have." He almost smiled, not quite, but close. "Let's ride," he said. They retrieved her bag from the shelter cabin and then descended toward the valley, Evelyn riding in front of him on Porter's back. It was the only option with one horse, and they'd settled it practically without either of them making it awkward, which he noticed. The horse moved carefully, picking its way through the aftermath of the storm, and Colton kept one arm loosely at her back to steady her on the rough sections without making a production of it. She didn't talk much on the ride down. Neither did he. There wasn't much to say that the situation hadn't already said, and he was the kind of man who didn't add words to fill silence. What he noticed was that she didn't either. That, he thought, that was something. The valley came into view around mid-morning, the smoke from Hatcher's Creek's chimneys, the dark line of the main road, the distant shapes of buildings against the white landscape. Even from a distance, he could see that word had gotten out. There were people near the edge of town. Someone had seen them coming down the ridge. He could feel Evelyn go still in front of him. "They're watching," she said. "Small town. They watch everything. What will they think of this?" She didn't specify what this was. She didn't need to. "Some of them will think I was a fool for riding out," he said. "Some of them will decide something about you before you've opened your mouth. Give it time." He paused. "Or don't. Either way, you'll prove them right or wrong yourself. That's the only way it works out here." She was quiet for a moment. "Your letters," she said, "mentioned once that you didn't have much patience for other people's opinions." "I don't. That's one of the things I liked about your letters." Porter walked steadily toward the town. The figures at the edge of the road were taking shape now. He could make out Gus Dolliver, and beside him the taller shape of Dr. Ambrose, which meant Gus had had the sense to bring him. Colton was grateful for that, at least. Evelyn Hartwell sat straight on the horse ahead of him, her recovered bag slung across her lap, her borrowed socks visible above boots that had seen better days. Her hair was still loose. She'd made no effort to fix it. He thought, she came 1,100 miles. He thought, she walked out of a cabin alone in November. He thought, she said, I know what I agreed to, and she meant it. The town came up to meet them, and the watching began, and Colton Mercer rode beside the woman he'd gone looking for through one of the worst nights of his life and found alive on the other side of it, and did not think, even for a moment, that he had been a fool to go. Dr. Ambrose was a small man with large hands, and the particular manner of someone who had seen enough frontier medicine to be unsentimental about almost everything. He met them at the edge of town, took one look at Evelyn, and said nothing to Colton at all. Just reached up and helped her down from Porter with a practiced efficiency that suggested he'd assessed the situation in about 4 seconds and moved on to the solution. Can you walk? He asked her. Yes. Both feet? The left one's worse than the right. All right, my office is 50 yards. Take my arm if you need it. She didn't take his arm. She walked the 50 yards herself, with a gait that was careful and slightly uneven and clearly cost her something, but she did it without asking for help and without making it a performance. Colton watched her go, and then turned to find Gus Dolliver standing beside him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. She's alive, Gus said. She is. You're both alive. We are. Gus looked at him for a long moment. Then he took Colton's horse by the bridle without being asked and led Porter toward the livery, shaking his head in a way that managed to communicate both relief and a deep personal frustration at the entire situation. The town watched. That was the thing about Hatcher's Creek. It was small enough that anything out of the ordinary drew people to doorways and windows without anyone having to announce it. Colton walked toward Dr. Ambrose's office through a gauntlet of observation that he felt on the back of his neck like a second cold. He didn't look at any of them. He kept walking. Inside the doctor's office, Evelyn was already seated on the examination table with her boots off, and Ambrose was doing to her feet exactly what Colton had done in the shack, with the addition of better lighting and a professional's vocabulary for what he was finding. He looked up when Colton came in. 2 toes on the left foot with superficial frostbite. The rest is intact. He set her foot down with the same care he'd have given a piece of equipment he was putting away. She got lucky. Another hour outside in those temperatures and we'd be having a different conversation. I know, Colton said. I need to bandage these properly, and I need her off her feet for at least 3 days. He looked at Evelyn. You understand that? 3 days, she repeated. Not agreement, exactly. More like she was filing the information away to negotiate with later. 3 days minimum, Ambrose said, reading her accurately. Or I'll be taking toes instead of treating them. Your choice. She didn't argue after that. The question of where she would stay for those 3 days was resolved, without anyone actually making a formal decision about it, by Margaret Calloway, Ruth's sister-in-law, who ran the town's only boarding house and appeared in the doctor's doorway about 20 minutes after Colton arrived, wearing her good coat over her house dress, having clearly walked there directly upon hearing the news. She'll stay with me, Margaret announced to the room. This was not a question. I have the front room empty. It's warm and it's clean and it's not a doctor's office. She looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a woman who had decided something and was simply waiting for the universe to catch up. You'll be comfortable. Evelyn looked at Colton. It was a brief look, not asking permission, more like checking his read on the situation. Margaret's a good woman, he said. You'll be fine there. All right, Evelyn said. To Margaret, thank you. Margaret waved a hand that dismissed the thanks as unnecessary and began organizing the practicalities of getting Evelyn from the examination table to the boarding house with the focused energy of someone for whom helping people was primarily a logistical exercise. Colton stayed until Evelyn was settled, helped carry her bag, stood in the doorway of the front room while Margaret showed her where the wash basin was and where the extra blankets were kept. The room was plain, white walls, a braided rug, a window that looked out on the main street. But it was warm, and it was solid, and it was not a line shack. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room with an expression he couldn't entirely read. I'll come by tomorrow, he said. She looked at him. Something moved through her eyes. Not quite relief, and not quite anything else he had a name for. All right, she said. He nodded once and left before he could say anything else, because he was not a man who knew how to end conversations gracefully, and he'd already used up whatever social capacity he had for the day. Outside, the cold hit him again, and he stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, feeling the specific exhaustion of a man who had been awake for 30-something hours and was only now allowing his body to acknowledge it. He needed to get Wyatt. He got back on Porter, who had been watered and briefly rested at the livery thanks to Gus, and rode the 3 miles to Ruth Calloway's house with his eyes barely open and his body running on something that was mostly stubbornness at this point. Wyatt was in Ruth's kitchen when Colton walked in. The boy was sitting at the table with a bowl of something in front of him, and he looked up when his father came through the door with an expression that cycled through several things very quickly. Relief, anger at the relief, an attempt to look like none of that had happened, before settling on a studied neutrality that was completely unconvincing. "You were gone a long time," Wyatt said. "I know. Ruth said you went to find the bride lady." "I did." Wyatt poked at whatever was in his bowl. "Did you find her?" "I did." The boy was quiet for a moment. He had his mother's coloring, dark hair, a face that kept its feelings close, but he had Colton's way of going still when he was thinking hard about something. "Is she dead?" "No, she's at Margaret Calloway's boarding house. She'll be fine." Another silence. Wyatt put his spoon down and looked at the table. "Was it bad? Out there?" Colton pulled out the chair across from his son and sat down. His bones wanted to stay sitting for about a week. "It wasn't good." "But you're okay." "I'm okay." Wyatt picked up his spoon again. He didn't say anything else, and Colton didn't push it. He knew his son well enough to know that this was not the end of the conversation, just the end of this portion of it. Wyatt would come back to things in his own time, at an angle, when he'd worked out what he actually wanted to know. Ruth brought Colton a cup of coffee and a plate of food without being asked, and then made herself scarce with the instincts of a woman who understood when a room needed to be smaller. He ate. He drank the coffee. Wyatt finished his bowl of what turned out to be some kind of turnip and potato combination that he was clearly enduring rather than enjoying. "She didn't turn back," Wyatt said, eventually, to the table. "What?" "The bride lady. She didn't turn back when the coach crashed." He looked up. "She kept coming." Colton set his fork down. "She did." Wyatt turned this over in his expression. A 7-year-old processing a fact and deciding what it meant. "Okay," he said finally, which was all he said, but Colton understood it as the significant statement it was. He let Wyatt sleep at Ruth's that night because he was too tired to ride back to the ranch safely, and because Ruth offered the sofa without making it feel like charity. He was asleep within about 4 minutes of lying down. He dreamed of nothing. Sometimes that was the best possible outcome. The next morning he rode back to town, collected Wyatt, and stopped at Margaret Calloway's boarding house before heading to the ranch. He didn't plan to stay long, just to check in, the way you checked on an injured animal to make sure the night hadn't changed anything. Evelyn was sitting up in bed with Jane Eyre open in her lap and a cup of tea on the nightstand, and she looked considerably more present than she had the day before. More color. More focus. Margaret had apparently also produced some clothing, one of her own older dresses that was slightly too wide in the shoulders for Evelyn's frame, but was clean and warm, which were the qualities that mattered. Wyatt stood in the doorway of the room and looked at her. Evelyn looked at him. Colton stayed where he was and let it happen. "You're Wyatt," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am." "Your father told me about you." Wyatt's eyes cut briefly to Colton, something between alarm and curiosity. "What did he say?" "That you're smart and quiet, and you don't trust new people easily." A pause. "That's private information," Wyatt said. "Probably." She didn't seem particularly concerned about it. "He also said you were a good kid. He said that first, actually, before the other things." Wyatt absorbed this with the careful expression of someone receiving a report that needed verification. He looked at his father again, differently this time. Colton said nothing. He was watching Wyatt work through it. "Your feet are hurt," Wyatt said to Evelyn. He'd noticed the bandaging visible below the hem of the borrowed dress. "2 toes. They'll be fine." "Does it hurt?" "Some." "Pa got frostbite on his left hand one time," Wyatt said, with the tone of someone producing credentials. "The 2 fingers. He didn't tell anybody for 2 days." "Wyatt," Colton said. "It's true." "It's true," Colton agreed. "It was also not my best decision." Evelyn was looking at Wyatt with an expression that was careful, attentive, not performing warmth, which the boy would have seen through immediately, but genuinely paying attention to him in the way she paid attention to everything. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Wyatt considered this like a negotiation. "What?" "This book." She held it up slightly. "Have you read it?" He looked at the cover. "No." "Do you like to read?" "Sometimes. Depends on the book." "What kind do you like?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Adventures and things about animals. Pa got me a book about horses last winter." "I don't have any books about horses," Evelyn said. "But this one has some good parts. The main character gets herself into a lot of trouble by being too stubborn to ask for help." Wyatt's mouth did something that was almost a smile. "That sounds like Pa." "It sounds like several people in this room," Evelyn said, and she did not look at Colton when she said it, but he felt it anyway. They stayed for 20 minutes. When they left, Wyatt walked to the horse without being told and mounted up behind his father, and when they were out of earshot of the boarding house, he said quietly, to the back of Colton's coat, "She's not what I thought she'd be." "What did you think she'd be?" "I don't know. More—" He trailed off, searching for it. "More like Mrs. Pemberton." Mrs. Pemberton was the school teacher, a woman of approximately 60 who wore the same gray dress every day and spoke to children in a tone that suggested she found them professionally necessary but personally exhausting. "No," Colton said. "She's not like Mrs. Pemberton." Wyatt held on to his father's coat and said nothing else for a while. Then, "Is she going to stay?" It was the question Colton had been turning over since the line shack, since the ride down from the mountains, since Evelyn Hartwell had sat on an examination table and told the doctor 3 days like it was a sentence she intended to appeal. "She says she is," he said. "Do you think she means it?" He thought about her walking 50 yards on frostbitten feet rather than taking the doctor's arm. He thought about her sitting up reading, wearing a dress that didn't fit, drinking someone else's tea in a room she'd never seen before, looking like she'd made peace with all of it. "I think she means most things she says," Colton said. "Yeah." Wyatt seemed to find this adequate. He held on, and they rode back to the ranch through the cold. The 3 days became 4, because Dr. Ambrose was not a man who revised his estimates lightly, and on the second day he'd found a spot on Evelyn's right heel that he wanted to watch for another 24 hours before declaring victory. She accepted this with visible restraint and spent the extra day reading and talking to whoever came through Margaret's boarding house, which in a small town meant she had effectively met half of Hatcher's Creek by the time she was cleared to walk. People came with food. That was how it worked out here. An injured stranger showed up, and the town's instinct was to bring casseroles and opinion in roughly equal measure. Margaret's front room became a kind of informal gathering point, with women Evelyn had never met arriving with pots of soup and baskets of bread, and invariably questions that were dressed up as conversation. Nora Whitfield came on the second day. She was the wife of the man who owned the feed store, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the directness of someone who had decided long ago that life was too short for indirection. She sat across from Evelyn with a cup of Margaret's coffee and looked at her steadily. "You're younger than I expected," Nora said. "People keep saying that," Evelyn said. "It's because Colton's been alone long enough that people picture him with someone who has more—" She paused, choosing. "More mileage." "I've had a reasonable amount of mileage for my age," Evelyn said. Nora's expression shifted slightly, reassessing. "You from St. Louis, originally. Born there. Grew up there." Evelyn set her tea down. "My father had a business, dry goods. He died when I was 19 and the business went with him, which is when I learned that what you grow up with and what you can rely on are not always the same thing." Nora was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard lesson at 19. It was useful, though." Evelyn looked at the window. The main street of Hatcher's Creek, gray and cold and nothing like St. Louis. "I stopped waiting for things to be secure before I moved. Security was taking longer than I had patience for." "Is that why you answered the advertisement?" "Partly." Evelyn turned back from the window. "Partly because his letters were honest. Most men write what they think you want to hear. He wrote what was true, and some of it wasn't flattering." A brief pause. "That seemed like a man worth knowing." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood, straightened her coat, and picked up the empty basket she'd brought the bread in. "You'll do all right here," she said. Not warmly, exactly. More like a verdict delivered by someone with standing to deliver it. Provided you're as practical as you sound. I intend to be, Evelyn said. After Nora left, Evelyn sat with her hands around her cup and looked at the room and thought about what she'd said. I stopped waiting for things to be secure before I moved, and whether she believed it as much as she'd made it sound. She believed it enough. That was the most honest answer. She believed it enough to have gotten on a stagecoach, enough to have walked out of that shelter cabin, enough to still be here rather than looking into the cost of a ticket back east. That would have to be sufficient. Colton came by each of the 4 days. He never stayed long. He had a ranch to run, an animal operation that didn't pause for weather or personal situations, and Wyatt had school 3 days a week and the kind of 7-year-old energy that required management. But he came, and he sat in the chair beside the window, and they talked. Not about the future, not about logistics or plans or what the wedding would look like. They talked about other things, the ranch, specific and detailed, because he'd discovered she actually wanted to know and wasn't asking to be polite. About the cattle operation, the winter grazing situation, the fence line on the north pasture that had been giving him trouble since October. She asked questions that were specific and sometimes surprised him. She'd clearly read more about cattle ranching than he'd expected, which he mentioned. I had 4 months to prepare, she said. I went to the library. In St. Louis. They had 3 books on frontier agriculture and 1 on cattle management. I read all of them. He looked at her. How much of it was useful? About half. She considered. The cattle management book was written by someone who had clearly never been west of Ohio, but the principles were sound. He almost said something about her going to the library to prepare to marry a man she'd never met, and the particular commitment that represented going to the library, taking notes probably, treating a mail-order marriage like a subject to be studied. But he let it go. He filed it away instead, in the same place he was filing all the things about her that were more than he'd expected. On the 4th day, Dr. Ambrose declared her cleared for walking, moderate activity, and no sustained standing for another week. She thanked him with the same directness she applied to everything and asked him what she owed him. He told her. She paid him from a small purse she produced from her bag without any drama about it. He looked faintly surprised. Colton suspected he'd expected her to defer to the man, to say speak to Colton about it, or something similar. She didn't. She settled her own bill and said good morning and walked out of his office under her own power. That afternoon, standing on the sidewalk outside Margaret's boarding house with her bag at her feet and the main street of Hatcher's Creek arranged in front of her in all its rough, unpolished reality, Evelyn Hartwell made the decision that she'd been working toward since she'd climbed out of a wrecked stagecoach on the side of a mountain. She didn't make it out loud. She didn't announce it to anyone. She just looked at the town, the rutted street, the wooden buildings, the mountains beyond them that were beautiful and absolute and did not care about her at all, and felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort exactly. More like resolution. The kind that comes when you've been arguing with yourself for long enough and one side finally wins. Colton arrived with the wagon at 2:30. Wyatt was in the back, sitting on a folded blanket, watching her with the careful eyes of a child who was still making up his mind about something. "Ready?" Colton said. He'd climbed down from the wagon and was standing in the street with his hat in one hand, which she'd noticed was what he did when he was uncertain about the social requirements of a situation. "Yes," she said. He loaded her bag. She climbed up onto the seat beside him without assistance, which he let her do. Wyatt scooted forward in the back so he could see between their shoulders. They drove out of town with a few people watching from doorways. Nora Whitfield raised a hand from the window of the feed store. Evelyn raised one back. The road to the Mercer Ranch ran south from town and then west, climbing gradually into the foothills. It was a good road by local standards, maintained mostly clear of rock, but it was nothing like the streets she'd grown up on. The landscape was extraordinary in the way that things were extraordinary when they were entirely indifferent to being looked at. She watched it go by and didn't try to make it into something comfortable. "How long until we reach the ranch?" she asked. "About 40 minutes in clear weather, Tim." Colton kept his eyes on the road. Longer in snow. "Is it always this cold in November?" "No, sometimes it's worse." She absorbed this without comment. Beside her, she felt him glance sideways briefly, checking her reaction. "Your house," she said. "How many rooms?" 4 kitchen, main room, 2 bedrooms. A pause. It's not large. That's fine. 4 rooms is more than adequate. From the back, Wyatt said, There's also the loft. Pa lets me sleep there in summer when it's hot. The loft was the original sleeping space when the house was built, Colton said, before I added the second room. You built the house? Evelyn asked. Most of it. The original structure was already there. I added the second bedroom the year Wyatt was born. She thought about that. A man adding a room onto a house for a child that was coming. The particular kind of anticipation in that act. Practical, not sentimental, but not without sentiment either. Did you build the barn as well? Extended it. 2 of the ranch hands helped with that. Took most of a summer. They talked like that for the rest of the drive. Specific, practical, nothing that required more than they were ready to give. It was, she thought, the same quality their letters had. A kind of honesty that worked by staying close to the concrete. She'd found it easier to be truthful with him in writing than she'd found it with most people in conversation, and she was finding now that the conversation had the same quality as the letters, which relieved something she hadn't entirely known she'd been carrying. The ranch came into view around a bend in the road. It was smaller than she'd imagined, which wasn't a criticism, just an adjustment. A white house with a covered porch. A large barn, dark-sided. Several outbuildings. Fencing that ran in both directions farther than she could see. Smoke coming from the chimney. Wyatt had left a fire going before they came to town. She registered this as the habit of a 7-year-old who had learned early that certain things mattered. Colton stopped the wagon in front of the house and climbed down. She climbed down on her own side. The ground was solid under her feet, different from the mountain terrain, lower and more stable, and she felt the difference through her still healing feet with something that was close to gratitude. She stood in front of the house and looked at it. It was not what she'd imagined. It was not worse than what she'd imagined either. It was simply real, which was different from imagined in ways that couldn't be accounted for in advance. Wyatt dropped out of the wagon bed and landed in the snow and looked at her. You want to see inside? He asked. The question was casual, covering something less casual. Very much, she said. He led her up the porch steps and through the front door with the particular gravity of a child showing someone something that mattered to him. And she followed him inside and looked at the kitchen with its iron stove and the main room with its 2 chairs by the window and the shelf of books along one wall. And she thought, this is where it starts. Not perfectly, not easily, not without the 100 small difficulties that came with 2 people and a child learning each other in close quarters, in winter, in the mountains. But here, this was where it started. The first 2 weeks at the Mercer Ranch were not difficult in the ways Evelyn had prepared for. She had prepared for cold. She had prepared for the physical demands of frontier housekeeping, the hauling of water, the management of a wood stove that had opinions about how it wanted to be fed, the particular arithmetic of making limited supplies stretch. She had read her books. She had thought it through. And the cold was indeed cold, and the stove did indeed have opinions, and water did not arrive at the kitchen without someone going to get it first. What she had not prepared for was the silence between 3 people learning how to occupy the same space without a shared history to fall back on. It wasn't hostile. That was the thing she kept coming back to. In the first days when she lay in the second bedroom, Colton had insisted on the bedroom. He'd moved his own things to a cot in the main room without making a discussion of it, and listened to the house settle in the cold. It wasn't hostile, and it wasn't cold in the human sense, and nobody was unkind. But there was a careful quality to everything, the way people moved around each other when they were still mapping the boundaries. Colton said what needed to be said and not much more. Wyatt watched her from the middle distance, always paying attention, rarely engaging directly unless she approached him first. She understood it. She even respected it, in the way she respected things that were honest about what they were. But understanding something and finding it comfortable were different matters. She had been there 4 days when she broke the silence in a way that nobody planned. It was early morning, before full light, and she had woken to the sound of Colton moving in the main room. She'd learned quickly that he rose before anyone and had the fire going and coffee made by the time the sky started to lighten. She'd been lying there, deciding whether to stay in bed or get up, when she heard a second sound, lower. Somewhere between a thud and a crash, followed by a silence that lasted just long enough to be concerning, followed by Colton's voice saying something short and sharp that she couldn't make out. She got up, pulled her shawl over her shoulders and her heavy socks on, and went to the main room. Colton was crouched beside the stove. He'd knocked over the cast iron pot he used for heating water. She could see the spilled water spreading across the wooden floor, steaming slightly. His right hand was pressed against his forearm, and the way he was holding it told her something before she could see the actual injury. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. Some men, when they were hurt, went embarrassed. He just looked tired. Caught the edge of the stove plate. "It's not bad." "Let me see." "It's not. Let me see it." He held out his arm. She crouched beside him and looked at the burn. A strip across the inside of his forearm, maybe 4 inches long, already angry and red. Not catastrophic, but not nothing. "Do you have anything for burns?" she asked. "Medicine kit, top shelf in the kitchen." She found it. The carbolic acid he'd used on her toes weeks ago, bandaging cloth, a small tin of what turned out to be a petroleum-based salve that she'd read about but never used. She brought it back and sat across from him on the floor. Not the chair, the floor, because he was on the floor and she was not going to crouch over him. And dressed the burn with a practicality that she could tell surprised him slightly. "You've done this before," he said. It was not quite a question. "My father's business had a warehouse. Things happened in warehouses." She worked carefully, not fast. "I used to help when there wasn't anyone else." He watched her hands. "How old were you?" 14 the first time, someone dropped a lamp. She smoothed the bandage's edge. "It wasn't as bad as it looked. They usually aren't." He was quiet for a moment. She finished and sat back. The water on the floor had stopped steaming. Outside, the first gray of morning was appearing at the kitchen window. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." She stood and got the mop from beside the back door and cleaned the water off the floor, because it needed doing and because she was already up, and because doing something with her hands was easier than deciding what to say next. He watched her do it. Then he got up and started the coffee, and she finished the floor, and they worked around each other in the small kitchen without getting in each other's way, which was a kind of progress. Wyatt came down at his usual time and found them both in the kitchen and looked at his father's bandaged arm and said, "What happened to your arm?" "Burned it." "On the stove?" "Yes." Wyatt looked at Evelyn. "Did you fix it?" "I dressed it," she said. "It'll heal on its own." The boy nodded with the solemnity of someone processing new information about how the household worked. Then he sat down at the table and accepted the bowl of oatmeal Evelyn set in front of him, and that was, without ceremony, without announcement, the first morning that felt like something other than careful strangers being careful with each other. The town was a more complicated situation. Hatcher's Creek was not unfriendly. It was watchful, which was different. A small community in hard country developed opinions about strangers the way trees developed rings, slowly, based on accumulated evidence, and not easily revised. Evelyn had made a reasonable impression in her 4 days at the boarding house, but a reasonable impression in a parlor was one thing. What people were actually waiting to see was how she held up against the rest of it. The rest of it began on the second Saturday, when Colton drove her into town for supplies, and she encountered Harold Fisk outside the general store. Harold Fisk was 63 years old, had been in the valley since before Hatcher's Creek was a town, and had managed over those decades to develop a reputation as a man who said what he thought without excessive concern for its reception. He was also, Colton had mentioned once in passing, the man who'd told him, directly and without softening, that he was making a fool of himself writing letters to a woman in St. Louis. He looked at Evelyn now with the expression of a man revisiting a prior assessment and not entirely sure how to handle the revision. "So you stayed," he said. Not unkind, just blunt. "I stayed," Evelyn agreed. "Most figure you'll be gone by spring." "Most are entitled to figure what they like." Harold looked at her for a moment, a long, unhurried look of the kind that older men in small towns sometimes gave people they were deciding about. Then something shifted in his face, very slightly. "You need anything at Haverford's, tell him I said to give you the fair rate. He has a tendency to charge new people more until somebody tells him not to." He walked on without waiting for a response. Colton, standing beside her, said nothing. "Was that help?" Evelyn asked. "From Harold Fisk, yes. That was significant help." She filed it away. Inside Haverford's general store, she bought what was on the list she'd made: flour, salt, lamp oil, a new bolt on the kitchen cupboard that had been hanging crooked since she'd arrived, and then she asked Haverford, who was a tall man with a permanent squint, whether he knew where she could find someone who would talk to her about the other ranch families in the valley. He looked at her sideways. What for? I want to understand how spread out the community is, whether there are children who have far to travel to reach the school. You thinking about the school? I'm thinking about a lot of things, she said. The school first. Haverford, who had been watching her with Colton's caution translated into shopkeeper's skepticism, appeared to make a decision. Ruth Calloway, he said. She knows everyone. Been here 15 years. She'll tell you what you want to know. Thank you, Evelyn said. She went to see Ruth Calloway that same afternoon, while Colton was loading supplies into the wagon. Ruth received her in a kitchen that smelled like bread and was warmer than anything Evelyn had been in since she'd arrived, and they sat across from each other with coffee, and Ruth looked at her with the comfortable directness of a woman who had nothing to prove. What is it you're actually asking? Ruth said, after Evelyn had laid out her questions about the school. I'm asking whether there's a need, Evelyn said, and whether anyone would object to me trying to address it. The school has Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Pemberton teaches 3 days a week and goes home to her sister's house in town every evening, Evelyn said. The families on the east side of the valley have children who travel 2 hours each way in winter weather to attend those 3 days. I'd like to understand if there's appetite for something more. Ruth was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in both hands. Where'd you teach before? I didn't. I worked in an office. A pause. But I was well educated, and I'm aware that out here those two things are sometimes required to do the same job. Mrs. Pemberton will have opinions about that. I imagine she will. Ruth looked at her steadily. You're not asking my permission. No, Evelyn said. I'm asking your knowledge. They're different things. Something in Ruth's expression opened, just slightly. The Garner family has 3 children who can't make the trip in bad weather, she said. The Doyle family has 2, and there's the Morrison girl. She's 8 years old and her mother's been trying to teach her at home, but she doesn't have the materials. A pause. Those families have been talking about it for 2 winters. Nobody's done anything. I know, Evelyn said. That's why I'm asking. What happened next did not happen quickly. That was the reality of things in small communities. Nothing happened quickly. And anything that looked like it had happened quickly had actually been building for a long time in conversations and small decisions that didn't look like much individually. But it began that afternoon in Ruth Calloway's kitchen, and it moved forward because Evelyn moved it. She went to the families Ruth mentioned. She drove herself, borrowing one of the ranch horses and the smaller wagon because Colton had a ranch to run, and she was not going to ask him to take time away from it every time she needed to go somewhere. This caused its own small storm of commentary in town. A woman driving alone to the outlying ranches, in winter, apparently without concern about what people would say about it. She was aware people were talking. She simply declined to let that be the most important thing. The Garner family lived 40 minutes east of town. Their 3 children, 12, 9, and 6, had been missing approximately half the school sessions due to weather and distance. Mrs. Garner, a thin woman with work-roughened hands and eyes that were both tired and sharp, opened the door and looked at Evelyn with barely concealed suspicion. "You're Mercer's bride," she said. Evelyn Hartwell, yes. She hadn't yet changed her name because there had not yet been a wedding. This was another thing people had opinions about. I wanted to talk to you about your children's schooling, if you have a few minutes. Mrs. Garner let her in. She didn't offer coffee until 15 minutes into the conversation, which Evelyn took as a sign of actual warming rather than courtesy. By the time Evelyn left the Garner homestead, she had a promise that the family would attend a meeting at the Hatchers Creek Church Hall on the first Saturday of December, if such a meeting were to be organized. She drove to the Doyle family next, then the Morrisons. She came home in the late afternoon with cold hands and a list of names and a clearer picture of what the valley actually needed than anyone had apparently taken the trouble to gather before. Colton was in the barn when she arrived. He came out when he heard the wagon and stood in the barn doorway watching her climb down and tie the horse, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't entirely read, something between uncertainty and something else she didn't have a name for yet. "You went to the Garner place," he said. Nora Whitfield had apparently mentioned it at the feed store, small town, and the Doyles, and the Morrisons. He came forward and took the horse's bridle without comment, began unhitching the traces. She helped, which she'd been learning, not perfectly, not with the efficiency of someone who'd done it for years, but competently enough that he'd stopped asking her if she needed help. "What are you planning?" he said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "A community meeting, to talk about expanding the school's reach." She pulled the left trace free and looped it. "There are at least 12 children in this valley who aren't getting consistent education because the current arrangement doesn't account for distance and weather." He was quiet for a moment, working. "Mrs. Pemberton is not going to like this," he said. "Mrs. Pemberton is going to like that someone else is willing to do additional work with no pay," Evelyn said, "once she thinks about it." A pause. Something shifted in his expression, almost a smile. Almost. "You've talked to her already." "I stopped at her house on the way back." Evelyn reached for the other trace. She was difficult for the first 10 minutes. Then she was practical. Colton looked at her. The late afternoon light was coming through the barn door at a low angle, the kind of winter light that was thin and specific, and it fell across her face while she worked, and he thought, not for the first time, but with more clarity than before, that she was not what he'd expected, and that this was entirely to his advantage. "You need anything from me?" he said. "The use of your name when I talked to Harold Fisk about using the church hall." She glanced at him. "He'll say yes faster if it comes from you as well." "He'll say yes because he already likes you," Colton said. "But fine." She seemed to file this away with interest. "He likes me?" "He told Gus Dolliver you were plain-spoken and not idiotic, which from Harold is essentially a declaration of deep affection." She laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, a real one, not the polite version. And it was slightly surprised, like she'd caught herself at it. It lasted only a moment before she got it back under control, but he caught it and held on to it. The question of the wedding, meanwhile, had been sitting between them with the patient weight of something that needed to be addressed and hadn't been, because the practical business of the first weeks had crowded everything else out. It was Evelyn who raised it, which he'd expected. She raised things. He tended to wait. She raised it one evening when Wyatt was already asleep in the loft, in the particular quiet of a winter night when the house was warm and the world outside was not, and they were sitting in the 2 chairs by the main room window doing separate things. He was going over the ranch's winter supply accounts. She was writing a letter to her mother, a correspondence she maintained with a regularity that suggested duty and something warmer, though she didn't often discuss the content. She set her pen down and turned to him. "We should talk about the wedding." He set down his papers. "All right. Soon, I think, before the community meeting, not because of appearances." She said it quickly, like she was preempting the assumption. "Because I think it will be easier to do the work I want to do here as your wife than as a woman living at your ranch with an ambiguous arrangement." He understood the practicality of it. He also understood that it was not only practicality, and he thought she knew that he knew that. "Soon," he said. "I can speak to Reverend—" "Not a church ceremony," she said. It came out flat, and then she corrected its tone. "I'd prefer not, if that's acceptable." A beat. "A civil ceremony would suit me, if it suits you." He looked at her. "It suits me," he said. Something in her shoulders, something small and held, released slightly. "Good." She picked up her pen again. "Are there family members you need to notify?" "My brother in Denver? We're not close. I'll write him." "I'll write my mother." She paused over the page. "She'll have something to say about it." She usually does, constantly and with conviction. She didn't say it with bitterness, just accuracy. "She loves me and she disagrees with most of my decisions. It's a consistent combination." He thought about his own father, who had been a man of fixed and confident opinions, who had been wrong about a significant number of things and had never once changed his mind about any of them. A different version of the same problem. "My father thought coming to Colorado was the worst idea I ever had," he said. He died before he could see that it wasn't. Evelyn looked up from her letter. "How long have you been here?" 12 years. "You were—" She did the arithmetic quietly. "Very young. 22. Margaret Calloway would call it reckless." Margaret Calloway would be right. She looked at him steadily. "I'd also call it reckless and mean it as a compliment." He held her gaze for a moment. The fire settled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in the low, continuous way it did when the temperature was serious about itself. "Saturday week," he said. "If that works." She understood he meant the wedding. "Saturday week," she agreed, and that was the extent of the conversation. No sentiment, no ceremony about it. Two people deciding the most significant thing and then returning to their separate papers, which was either entirely unromantic or the most honest version of romance available to them at this point in their knowing each other. Evelyn suspected it was the latter. She was not sure Colton had the vocabulary for the sentimental version, and she was honest enough with herself to know that she wasn't entirely sure she did either. The community meeting happened first, on a Thursday evening at the church hall, with 8 families represented and a fire going in the iron stove at the hall's center, and Harold Fisk sitting in the back row with his arms crossed, which was his version of official attendance. Evelyn stood at the front of the room and told them, plainly and without performance, what she'd found in her visits to the outlying families. She told them the numbers: children, distances, sessions missed, skills not being built. She told them what she thought could be done with minimal additional cost, using what was already available, adding 1 afternoon session per week at the church hall for families on the east side of the valley, rotating a teaching role between herself and Mrs. Pemberton, who was present in the second row with the expression of someone who had decided to be open-minded but wanted credit for the effort. She answered questions. Some were practical. Some were skeptical. One man, whose name she didn't know yet, asked what business a newly arrived woman had reorganizing arrangements that had worked well enough for years. "Well enough," Evelyn said, "is not the same as well." The room was quiet for a moment. "My children can read," he said. "That's well enough." "Your children can read," she agreed. "The Morrison girl can't, and she's 8. I'd like to change that if this community is willing to help me do it." Nobody argued after that. Not because she'd convinced everyone, she hadn't, and she knew it, but because the argument, stated plainly, didn't have a comfortable place to stand. They voted. It wasn't a formal vote. It was the frontier version, which was people nodding and nobody saying no loudly enough to stop it. The East Valley sessions would begin in January. Harold Fisk left without comment. On his way out, he paused beside her and said, "Told you you'd do all right," and kept walking. She stood at the front of the nearly empty hall and felt the specific exhaustion of having done something that mattered and having no one to celebrate it with in the way you celebrated such things. No friends from before, no family, nobody who'd known her long enough to understand what it had cost. She'd been in Hatcher's Creek for less than a month. She was not, by any reasonable measure, established here. But the Morrison girl was going to learn to read, and 12 children were going to have more consistent schooling, and she'd stood in front of a room full of strangers and made the case, and they'd said yes. That was something. That was, in fact, a great deal. Colton was waiting with the wagon outside. He'd been in the room for the whole of it, sitting near the back, saying nothing. She climbed up beside him, and he drove out of town in the dark without speaking. And she was grateful for the quiet because she needed a few minutes to simply exist without being competent at anything. After a while, he said, "The man who asked about your business, his name's Fletcher Dodd. He's not a bad man. He's slow to change." "I know," she said. "I'm not bothered by him." "I know you're not." A pause. "You handled it well." She looked at the dark road. "I handled it adequately," she said. "There's a difference." He glanced at her sideways and she caught it, and they both said nothing, and the horse moved steadily through the cold. The wedding was 9 days later, on a Saturday morning in the county clerk's office in Hatcher's Creek, with Ruth Calloway and Gus Dolliver as witnesses because they were available and willing, and because Evelyn did not have family present and Colton's brother had not made the trip from Denver, which Colton had not appeared surprised by. Wyatt stood to one side in his good shirt, which Ruth had helped him iron the night before, with an expression of intense seriousness that Evelyn had come to recognize as his version of caring a great deal about something. The ceremony was brief. The county clerk, a man named Aldous Perry, who handled weddings with the same administrative focus he applied to land disputes, read the necessary words. They said what was required. Colton put a plain gold band on her finger. She hadn't known about the ring, hadn't thought to expect it, and felt something move through her chest unexpectedly when she felt its weight. Afterward, outside on the sidewalk, Ruth hugged her with genuine warmth, and Gus shook Colton's hand and said something low that made Colton's expression shift in a way that Evelyn couldn't read from where she was standing. Harold Fisk, who had not been invited because nobody had specifically invited anyone, but who had somehow known and arrived, stood at the edge of the group with his hat in his hand and nodded at her once. She nodded back. Wyatt stood beside her, and after a moment, without announcement, he put his hand in hers, small and cold from the outdoor air and tentative, just resting there, not squeezing, not claiming anything, just present. She held it. She didn't make a thing of it. She just held his hand and looked at the mountains visible at the end of the street and thought, this is where it is now. This is the thing that's real, not the wedding, not the ceremony. The small, cold hand in hers, and the town watching from doorways, and the mountains that didn't care about any of it, and the long work of everything that was still ahead of them, years of it, unseen. She was not afraid of it. And she identified the feeling carefully, the way she did with feelings she wasn't sure of. She was ready for it. That was close enough. The first winter passed the way first winters do, harder than expected in some places, easier in others, with enough small catastrophes distributed throughout to prevent anyone from getting comfortable. In January, 3 of Colton's cattle died in a cold snap that dropped the temperature to something that had no business existing on a planet where people were expected to live. He found them in the north pasture on a Tuesday morning, frozen where they'd stood, which was not uncommon and was also, every time it happened, a specific kind of loss that didn't get easier with familiarity. He came back to the house with ice in his beard and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without taking his coat off, doing the arithmetic in his head. What those 3 animals represented in weight, in price, in the margin between a winter that worked out and one that didn't. Evelyn set coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and didn't say anything optimistic. She'd learned that about him quickly, that optimism applied from the outside felt like dismissal to him, like someone telling him the thing he was worried about didn't deserve the weight he was giving it. So she sat there and let him do his arithmetic and waited. "We're still all right," he said finally. "I know," she said. "It tightens things." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to—" "I know you're not." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm telling you I understand the situation. That's different from asking me to worry or not worry." He drank his coffee. She watched the calculation move through his face. Not just the cattle, she thought, but the broader thing, the constant management of a life built on variables that didn't cooperate. She'd understood this intellectually before she arrived. She understood it differently now, in her body, in the particular attention she paid every morning to the sky and the temperature, the way she'd started reading weather, the way she'd once read balance sheets. "April will be better," he said. Not to her, to himself. "April will be better," she agreed. It was. But between January and April, there was February, which brought a 3-day storm that kept them housebound and a dispute with the neighbor to the east. A man named Gareth Holt, who ran a larger operation and had been in the valley long enough to feel entitled to certain water rights that the law didn't actually support. Colton had been managing the disagreement since before Evelyn arrived, with a combination of patience and cold stubbornness that had kept it from becoming anything more than tension. In February, it became more than tension. Holt sent 2 of his men to redirect a creek feed that supplied the Mercer Ranch's eastern pasture. They did it without notice, on a day when Colton was repairing the barn roof and didn't see it happen until one of the ranch hands came to tell him. What followed was not violent, but it was close. Colton rode to Holt's property in weather that was already bad and getting worse, and what passed between the 2 men when they met in Holt's yard lasted about 15 minutes and ended with a clear statement from Colton about what would happen if the creek feed wasn't restored by morning, delivered in the tone of a man who was not making a threat so much as announcing a natural consequence. The creek feed was restored by morning. Evelyn heard about it secondhand from Ruth Calloway, who heard about it from Holt's wife, who had apparently watched the whole thing from her kitchen window with the expression of a woman accustomed to her husband's decisions creating difficulties. Ruth mentioned it at the East Valley school session that Thursday with a careful neutrality that was its own kind of editorial. "Holt won't forget it," she said. "He's the kind of man who remembers." "So is Colton," Evelyn said. She was arranging the lesson materials on the table at the church hall, not looking up. "He just doesn't bring it up constantly." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You're not worried? About Holt?" "No." She set down the primers. "About the water rights in general, yes. It'll come up again. Probably in summer when the creek runs lower." She looked at Ruth. "I've been looking at the county records. The original deed has language that's been misread for 20 years. I'd like to get someone to look at it properly. Ruth blinked. You've been looking at county records. I've been looking at a lot of things. She said it without particular emphasis, the way she said most things. This valley has been running on handshake arrangements and assumptions for long enough that nobody's sure what's actually documented. That's fine until it isn't. Ruth looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, a reassessment happening in real time. Does Colton know you're doing this? I told him I was interested in the deed. He said the box with the land papers was on the top shelf in the bedroom, and I could look at whatever I wanted. She paused. I think he meant it as a permission. I treated it as one. The school sessions were working. That was the cleaner part of the winter, the thing that went more right than wrong. The Morrison girl, Clara, 8 years old, with a stubborn mouth and eyes that tracked everything, could read simple sentences by February and full paragraphs by March, with a speed that suggested she'd been waiting for someone to give her the materials and the time. Clara's mother cried at the March session quietly in the back of the room when Clara read aloud from a primer with the confidence of a person who had learned she could do a thing. Evelyn noticed and did not make a production of it. She kept teaching. The other children were slower but steady. 2 of the Garner kids had gaps that took longer to address. The 9-year-old had been told for 2 years that numbers weren't his strength, which Evelyn discovered was not true. He just learned them differently than the method Mrs. Pemberton favored. She adjusted. He improved. Mrs. Pemberton, to her credit, asked about the adjustment and then implemented it in her own sessions without requiring credit for it, which raised Evelyn's opinion of her considerably. Wyatt, meanwhile, was conducting his own slow and private adjustment to the changed landscape of his life. He was not difficult. That was the thing Evelyn always came back to when she thought about those months. He was never difficult, never openly resistant, never the hostile child she'd half prepared for. He was simply careful. He watched. He tested in small ways that were so subtle she'd have missed them if she hadn't been paying close attention. He forgot to tell her that his boots had worn through until she noticed and asked directly, which she understood as a test of whether she paid attention. She did, and she took him to town for new boots without making it a lesson, and he accepted this with a gravity that was almost formal. He left her a drawing once. Just set it on the kitchen table where she'd find it when she came in from the yard and was already outside again before she saw it. A rough sketch in pencil, a horse, a house, 3 stick figures. The tallest one was labeled Pa in uncertain letters. The small one was labeled Me. The third one, medium height, was not labeled at all, but was standing between the other 2. She kept it. She put it in the back of Jane Eyre, between the last page and the back cover. She didn't tell him she'd done this, but she suspected he knew. The spring came, and with it the problems that spring brought. Calving season, which was its own particular form of controlled crisis, with Colton working hours that left him silent with exhaustion at the dinner table, and 2 difficult births that required the kind of intervention that was not pleasant and could not be romanticized. The ranch hand they'd relied on for the past 3 seasons, a man named Dex, who'd been with Colton since before Wyatt was born, gave notice in April because his brother's place in Wyoming needed help, and family was family. Colton absorbed this with the same expression he applied to most difficult news. A slight compression of his jaw, a pause, and then the practical next thought. They couldn't afford to replace Dex at the same wage. That was the plain truth of it. They had 2 younger hands, good workers, but inexperienced in ways that meant certain tasks fell back on Colton in a season where there was already too much work for the hours available. Evelyn began handling more of the operations administrative side than either of them had planned. Not the physical ranch work. She was learning that slowly, but she was realistic about what could be learned in 5 months. But the records, the accounts, the correspondence with buyers in Denver and Pueblo that Colton handled by instinct and had never particularly systematized. She organized it. She found 2 places where they'd been undercharging by a small but consistent margin for 2 seasons, and 1 supplier relationship where better terms were available if someone was willing to write the letters. She wrote the letters. In May, Colton came into the kitchen one evening where she was working at the table with the account book spread around her and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at what she was doing. "You found something," he said. He could read the specific quality of her concentration. "The Halverson contract. They've been paying us 8 cents under the Denver market rate for 2 years. She didn't look up from the figures. I think they assumed nobody was watching closely enough to notice. I wasn't, Colton said. I know. She made a note in the margin. I've drafted a letter. I'd like you to read it before I send it. He came to the table and picked up the draft. Read it, put it back down. It's firm. It's accurate. Halverson's been a buyer for 6 years. Then he can afford to pay the correct rate for another 6. She looked up at him. If he objects, there are 2 other buyers in Denver who'd take the contract. I looked into it. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. The business calculation alongside the older, more instinctive calculus of long relationships and frontier courtesy, and what you owed a man for 6 years of reliable payment, even if the payment was wrong. Send it, he said. She sent it. Halverson responded within the week, without argument, agreeing to the corrected rate. She suspected he'd known exactly what he'd been doing and had simply been hoping nobody would look. Colton didn't say much about it afterward, but she noticed the following week that he'd come home from town with a book, Applied Principles of Agricultural Business, something she'd mentioned once in passing as being useful, and left it on the kitchen table without comment. She thanked him. He said it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. Summer arrived with the particular violence of high country summers, brief and intense, and followed by the knowledge of what was coming again. The drought that hit in July was the worst thing the ranch had faced since Colton had owned it, and it hit 3 weeks into a run of high temperatures that had already put the pasture grass under stress. The creek that Gareth Holt had tried to redirect in February ran low in July, as Evelyn had predicted. Holt sent a man to talk to Colton about a shared arrangement, which was a negotiation he'd refused to have in winter and was now proposing from a weaker position. Colton handled the negotiation. Evelyn had, 2 months earlier, gotten the deed language reviewed by a land attorney in Pueblo who confirmed what she'd suspected. The water rights were clearly documented in the Mercer Ranch's favor. Colton went into the conversation knowing the ground under his feet, which changed the character of it entirely. They reached an arrangement that was fair to both sides. Colton told her about it that evening with the sparse economy of language he used for things that had gone better than expected. Holt agreed to split costs on the channel maintenance. He gets access below the 3rd marker during low water. We keep primary rights. That's reasonable, she said. It's more than reasonable. He looked at her directly. The deed language. That was you. The attorney did the work. You found the attorney. You asked the question. He wasn't good at this, at giving credit, at saying the words for things. She could see the effort it took. I wouldn't have thought to look. She didn't deflect it or minimize it, because she'd learned that deflecting things he offered cost him something. Thank you, she said. He nodded once, which was the end of it, and that was fine. The drought eased in late August. The calves they'd brought through spring were healthy. The corrected Halverson contract meant they ended the year in better shape than the cattle losses of January had suggested they would. It was not prosperity. It was not abundance. But it was solid. And solid in this country was a thing you fought for and were grateful for when you had it. Their daughter was born the following February. They had not planned to talk about it publicly until they were certain of things. Evelyn had miscarried once, in the autumn, early enough that only the 2 of them knew, and the silence they'd kept around that loss had been one of the harder silences of their first year. She'd sat in the kitchen afterward with her hands in her lap, and he'd sat across from her and not tried to put words to it, which was the right thing and also the only thing he knew how to do, and she'd been grateful for both. So when February came and the baby was real and present and making her opinions about the world loudly known, there was a quality to it that had more weight than a first birth might have carried. Evelyn lay in the bedroom with the child on her chest and felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who had done something significant and was still in the immediate aftermath of it. And Colton stood beside the bed with an expression on his face that she had not seen before. She was too tired to analyze it carefully, but she filed it away. She's healthy, Dr. Ambrose said, packing his bag with the brisk efficiency of a man who had seen enough of these to have calibrated his concern to the actual situation. Both of them are. Colton said nothing. He was looking at his daughter with the expression Evelyn had filed away, and she thought, in the clear, simplified thinking of genuine exhaustion, that she was seeing something he didn't have walls around because he hadn't had time to build them. Wyatt appeared in the doorway. He'd been kept in the kitchen for the last several hours in Ruth Calloway's company, and he came to the bedroom threshold now with 8-year-old dignity and looked at the baby with an expression that cycled rapidly through several things. "She's small," he said. "She'll get larger," Evelyn said. "Does she have a name?" Evelyn looked at Colton. They'd discussed names, but not settled. He looked at her back, in the way he sometimes did when he was deferring a decision to her, not because he didn't have an opinion, but because he thought her opinion had more standing. "Margaret," she said, "for Ruth's sister-in-law." A pause. "If that's all right." "It's all right," he said. Wyatt came to the edge of the bed and looked at Margaret Mercer, who was sleeping with the absolute commitment of a person who had recently done something strenuous and intended to recover from it thoroughly. He reached out one finger and touched the back of the baby's hand, very gently, the way you touched something you weren't sure about. The baby's fingers closed around his. Wyatt stood very still. "She's holding on," he said. "She does that," Evelyn said. "It's a reflex." "Oh." He didn't move. The baby kept holding. He stayed there for a long time, standing at the edge of the bed with his finger in his sister's grip, and Evelyn watched his face in the lamplight and thought about the drawing that was still tucked in the back of Jane Eyre, the one with 3 stick figures and only 2 names, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since the night she'd sat in a shelter cabin writing a letter to a man she'd never met and telling him she wasn't afraid. She had been afraid. She could admit it now, at this distance, in this room. She had been afraid, and she had come anyway, and she was here, and this was what here looked like. A bedroom in Colorado, a child asleep on her chest, a man standing at the window with his back to the room, doing something with his expression that required privacy. A boy with his finger in his sister's grip, not moving, not wanting to break it. The winter outside was doing what winter did. Inside, the stove ticked. The lamp on the nightstand threw a circle of warm light that didn't reach the corners of the room. Colton turned from the window. He looked at his son, then at his wife, then at the child between them. He didn't say anything. There wasn't a thing to say that would improve on what was already in the room. The harder years followed, as they always did. The summer of 1886 brought a drought worse than 1884, and this time it hit 3 consecutive months without meaningful rain, turning the pasture to something that barely qualified as grass and forcing decisions about which cattle to sell early and which to hold. Colton sold early and sold hard, and was right about the timing, but right about the timing still meant selling at lower prices than a good year would have produced. They finished that year thin. Not desperate. They'd built enough margin by then to absorb thin, but thin. Evelyn's school program by 1886 had grown beyond what she'd imagined when she'd sat across from Mrs. Garner asking about distance and weather. Clara Morrison, the 8-year-old who'd learned to read in the church hall sessions, was now 12 and helping teach the younger children, which was Clara's own initiative and not anything Evelyn had suggested. 3 families who'd been sending their children inconsistently had become families who came without fail because the sessions had adjusted to their schedules rather than expecting them to adjust to a schedule set by a town that didn't understand how far they lived. Mrs. Pemberton had, gradually and without ever making a formal declaration of it, come to treat Evelyn as a colleague rather than an intruder. They disagreed about methods regularly and agreed about outcomes consistently, which was, Evelyn thought, probably the most functional professional relationship available to 2 people who approach things differently. In the autumn of 1887, Evelyn was pregnant again, and this time she told Colton earlier than she'd told him about Margaret because they'd learned from the loss that silence about these things cost more than the precaution was worth. He received the news with the same compressed stillness he received most significant things, and then that evening he built a second shelf in the main room for books, without being asked, which was not connected to the news in any direct way, and which she understood as connected to the news in every way that mattered. Their son was born in May of 1888. They named him James, which was Colton's father's name, and which Colton offered without explanation and Evelyn accepted without requiring one. By then, the ranch had become something recognizably different from what it had been in 1883. Not dramatically. The mountains didn't care about drama, and the weather didn't, and the cattle market didn't, but the operation was larger, better documented, running on systems that Evelyn had built into it gradually enough that they felt like they'd always been there. The Halverson contract had led to 2 additional buyer relationships. The water rights dispute with Holt had led to a valley-wide conversation about shared infrastructure that had led, eventually, to a jointly maintained irrigation channel that 3 ranches used and nobody fought over. Colton was not good at receiving the acknowledgement that came with this. When other ranchers mentioned his operation with the particular respect given to something that had been done well, he said little and deflected toward the practical details. Evelyn watched this happen at the general store one afternoon. A conversation between Colton and 2 other ranchers in which one of them said, plainly, that the Mercer Ranch had become the best-run outfit in the valley, and Colton responded by talking about the new fencing method he'd tried on the south pasture. She didn't tease him about it, but later, at home, she said, "You could have just said thank you." "I thanked him," Colton said. "He was pulling his boots off at the door. You talked about fencing. That's relevant information." "It is," she agreed. "It was also a deflection." He looked at her. The same look he'd given her in the line shack 5 years ago, the one she'd come to understand meant he was recalculating something. "I don't need compliments." "No," she said. "But the man offering it needed you to receive it. That's different." She folded the shirt she'd been mending and set it aside. "It wasn't about you. It was about him having something to give." He sat with this for a moment, then, "I'll think about that." "That's all I'm asking," she said. He did think about it, because that was how he operated. Things went in, they took time, they came out as behavior change rather than conversation. 3 weeks later, she watched him receive a similar compliment from Harold Fisk with a brief, direct thank you, and 2 sentences about the ranch that managed to be both honest and not deflecting. And Fisk looked moderately startled and then pleased, and Evelyn looked at a point above their heads and did not smile visibly. Wyatt, at 13, was becoming a person who was harder to read than he'd been at 7, which was, Evelyn understood, entirely normal and also entirely different to live with. He'd had a year of difficult adjustment around the time James was born. Nothing she could point to directly, more like a general weather system. A teenage cloudiness that expressed itself in short answers and time spent alone in the barn, and a period of about 6 weeks where he seemed to hold something against her that she couldn't identify. She didn't push. She kept showing up. Breakfast, the small daily points of contact, interest in what he was doing that she tried to keep genuine rather than performed. In March of that year, she asked him to ride with her to check the East Pasture fence line, because she needed to go and because she'd found, over the years, that conversations with Wyatt worked better on horseback than face-to-face, with the landscape to look at rather than each other. They rode for 20 minutes without much talking. Then Wyatt said, abruptly, "Is it different? Having your own kids?" She understood immediately what he was asking beneath what he was asking. "James and Margaret are my kids," she said. "So are you." He was quiet. "Not in the same way," she added, because she thought honesty served him better than smoothing. "You had a mother before me. That's not erased, and I'd never try to erase it. But different isn't less." He kept his eyes on the pasture. A long pause. "I don't really remember her," he said. "My mother. I remember some things, but I don't know if they're real or if I made them up." She thought about this carefully before answering. "Probably both," she said. "That's usually how memory works when you're young. The feelings stay true even when the details shift." He seemed to turn this over. Then, "Pa doesn't talk about her." "No," she agreed. "Did he tell you about her?" "Some. Enough to know she was worth remembering." She chose the words carefully. "And enough to know that the not talking isn't forgetting. That's just how he carries things." Wyatt nodded. Not agreement, necessarily, but the acknowledgement of something. They rode on. The fence line was intact. On the way back, he said with the deliberate casualness that meant the opposite of casual, "You don't have to go to the East Pasture alone. I can ride with you when you need to check it." She looked at him, 13, trying to be 16, carrying his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and something that was entirely his own. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded and kicked his horse ahead, and that was the end of it, which meant it was also a beginning of something. The years stacked up the way they did out here. Not gently, not without cost, but with the particular solidity of things that had been built carefully. The droughts came and they managed them. The markets shifted and they adjusted. 2 more hard winters, 1 difficult calving season that nearly broke the budget. A summer fire that took one of the outbuildings and required 3 weeks of rebuilding. None of it was clean. None of it was what anyone would choose. But there was a Thursday in September of 1889, a specific evening, ordinary in every external way, when Colton sat at the kitchen table after dinner with James asleep against his arm, and Margaret at the other end of the table drawing something with extreme seriousness, and Wyatt was reading near the window, and Evelyn was washing the dishes with the particular lack of efficiency that came from being tired and not minding it. And Colton looked around the room with an expression she caught from across the kitchen. She didn't ask him what he was thinking. She knew what he was thinking, because she was thinking it too, that this was the thing. Not any single large moment, not the wedding, not the births, not the contracts or the water rights or the school sessions. All of those had been the work of building something. This was the thing that had been built. Not finished. Never finished. There was no finished out here. But this was what it looked like. This specific evening, this room, these 4 people, this ongoing, difficult, extraordinary, ordinary life. She finished the dishes. The lamp on the table threw light across all of them. Outside, September was cooling toward October, and October would become November, and November would remind them all, again, what this country was capable of. She was not afraid of it. She had not been afraid of it for a long time. 20 years changes a place the way water changes stone. Not all at once, not dramatically, but so completely that eventually you look at what's there and can barely remember what it was before. By 1903, the Mercer Ranch ran 1,200 head across 3 connected pastures, with a bunkhouse that housed 6 full-time hands and a barn that Wyatt had helped redesign the summer he turned 19, when he'd come back from 2 years of agricultural study in Denver, with ideas and the energy to implement them before anyone could argue against it. The original house still stood. Colton had refused to tear it down and build larger, which had been a point of genuine disagreement with Evelyn for about a year before she understood that the house wasn't just a structure to him, but it had grown in the way that honest houses grew, addition by addition, each new room representing something that had happened and needed space. Wyatt was 30 now. He ran the day-to-day cattle operation with an efficiency that occasionally made Colton feel both proud and faintly obsolete, which Colton dealt with by focusing on the areas of the ranch that still required his specific attention and by not discussing the obsolete feeling with anyone except, eventually, Evelyn. He discussed most things with Evelyn eventually. It had taken him years to learn how to do that, to convert the things he carried silently into words that another person could hear. And the learning had not been graceful, but it had happened, incrementally, the way most real changes happened. Margaret was 16, sharp-tongued and observant in ways that reminded everyone who knew the family of her mother at a similar age, though Evelyn maintained she'd been considerably more reserved. Margaret disputed this. The dispute was ongoing. James, 15, was quieter than his sister and more like Colton in his way of moving through the world, watching first, acting second, saying the necessary thing and not the unnecessary one. He'd developed, in the last year, a serious interest in the land itself rather than the cattle on it, in soil composition and water management, and the kind of long-view thinking about the land that Evelyn suspected would eventually take him somewhere different from ranching, though she kept this suspicion to herself. Clara Morrison, who had learned to read in the church hall at 8 years old, was now 27 and teaching school full-time in Hatcher's Creek, which had grown enough to support a proper schoolhouse built in 1894. She'd come to Evelyn 6 years ago and said, directly, that she wanted to teach and didn't know how to formalize it, and Evelyn had helped her write the letters and make the case to the county, and Clara had done the rest herself because Clara was that kind of person. The Valley School operated 5 days a week now. 14 children from the outlying ranches attended, some of them children of the same families who'd been missing sessions 20 years ago. The East Valley sessions that Evelyn had organized in the winter of 1883 had been absorbed into the official program by 1890. Nobody remembered particularly who had started it. Evelyn didn't mind. The point had never been credit. Hatcher's Creek had grown from the rough collection of buildings Evelyn had first seen to something that was beginning to look, from certain angles, like a real town. A hotel had opened in 1895, a bank the following year. A physician had settled permanently in 1897, relieving Dr. Ambrose, who was 70 and had earned his retirement, of the sole responsibility for the valley's medical needs. There was a post office and a telegraph line and a feed operation that served ranches as far as 30 miles out. Harold Fisk had died in 1899. He'd been buried in the Valley Cemetery on a cold November afternoon with more people in attendance than anyone had expected, including several who disagreed with him regularly and came anyway because you showed up for a man who'd been part of a place long enough to become part of its character. Evelyn had stood beside Colton at the graveside and thought about the first time Fisk had looked at her on the sidewalk outside Haverford's store and delivered his verdict. "You'll do all right here." She'd thought about it as a judgment then. She understood it now as something closer to a welcome, delivered in the only language Harold Fisk had available. It was November 1903 when Colton came to find Evelyn in the schoolroom she'd kept in the house even after the county school was established. A small room off the main hall where she still tutored occasionally and kept her books and did the correspondence that remained part of how she thought through problems, and stood in the doorway in the way he stood in doorways when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. She looked up from what she was writing. 20 years of marriage had given her a thorough map of his silences. This one had weight to it. "What is it?" she said. "You know what week it is." She set down her pen. She did know. She'd known since October that November was coming, and with it the anniversary. 20 years since a stagecoach tipped on the ice east of Grover's Pass. 20 years since a man she'd never met rode into a blizzard to find her. 20 years since two people who had no business trusting each other began the slow work of doing exactly that. "I want to go back to the cabin," he said. "If you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. He was 54 years old and looked it in the ways that mattered. The deep lines at the corners of his eyes, the gray through his hair, the particular solidity of a man who had spent decades doing physical work in hard country. He also looked like himself, which was the most she could say about anyone. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow. Day after, if the weather's uncertain." "The weather's always uncertain." "You sound like yourself when you say that." "I always sound like myself," she said. "Give me an hour to arrange things with Wyatt." Wyatt received this information with the practical acceptance of a man who had grown up understanding that his parents occasionally did things that made complete sense to them and required no additional explanation. "Roads will be icy above the tree line," he said. "Take Porter's son. He's better in elevation than any of the others." Colton looked at his son. "You named the horse after my horse." "You named your horse after a good horse," Wyatt said. "It's a working name." Margaret, who heard about the trip at dinner, was characteristically direct. "You're riding to the mountains in November for sentiment," she said. "That's unlike you." "People change," Evelyn said. "You haven't changed that much." She looked at her father. "Has she?" "Some," Colton said. Then, "No, not the parts that were already there." Margaret seemed to find this a satisfying answer, which meant she left it alone, which for Margaret was a significant form of approval. They left before full light the next morning, Evelyn and Colton, 2 horses and enough supplies for a 2-day ride. James stood on the porch to watch them go with a cup of something hot in both hands, doing what he always did. Observing, not commenting, storing whatever he was seeing in whatever part of himself he kept things. The road east from Hatcher's Creek was not the road it had been in 1883. It was maintained now, properly graded, with a relay station at the foot of the pass. The first several miles went easily, the horses moving well in the cold morning air, their breath rising in steady clouds. Evelyn rode beside Colton and watched the landscape and thought about the first time she'd seen these mountains. From a stagecoach window, traveling towards something she understood only in the abstract. The mountains had seemed absolute to her then. Indifferent. The kind of beautiful that had no interest in whether you survived it. She still thought they were indifferent. She'd just learned to be indifferent back, which was its own kind of relationship. "You're quiet," Colton said. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She considered how to say it. "About whether we would have done it if we'd known exactly what it would cost." He rode for a moment. "Would you have?" "Yes," she said. "But I wouldn't have been as calm about it." He made the sound that was the closest thing he had to a laugh. A short exhale through his nose, not quite amusement. "You weren't that calm." "I was calmer than I felt." She looked at the mountains. "I was terrified for approximately the first 3 months. I just didn't have time to show it." "I know," he said. I could tell. She looked at him. You never said anything. You weren't asking me to. He kept his eyes on the trail. You were managing it. Saying something would have gotten in the way. This was the kind of thing he'd never have said in the first years, when they were still learning each other's interior geography. It had taken time, a lot of time, more than she'd expected, for him to develop the language for what he observed, for the noticing to become something he could put into words without it feeling like exposure. She'd learned to wait for it. The waiting had always been worth it. They climbed above the tree line around midday. The temperature dropped immediately and sharply, the way it always did at elevation, and the landscape opened up into the white expanse she remembered from 20 years ago. Rock formations, scrub pine, the particular silence of high places that wasn't really silence but was the absence of human sound, which felt like the same thing. The relay station at Grover's Pass was staffed by a young man who looked barely old enough to be there and who told them the shelter cabin was another 2 hours east and the road was passable, but they should watch the north-facing sections because yesterday's wind had built drift on the edges. You know this country? He asked, looking at them with the assessment of someone who'd seen enough underprepared people try these trails to have opinions about it. We do, Evelyn said. The young man looked at her, at the surety in her voice, at the way she sat the horse, at whatever it was in her face that communicated 20 years of knowing exactly this specific terrain and its specific demands. He nodded. Keep east of the rock formation when you come down the far side, ice underneath the drift. Thank you, she said. The last 2 hours were the hardest. Not dramatically, they were experienced riders on good horses in terrain they knew. But the cold was serious and the trail was technical in places, and there was a section on the descent where the ice under the snow was exactly where the relay rider had said it would be. And Evelyn felt her horse shift and corrected it without panic, the way she would have been unable to do 20 years ago and could do now because 20 years of this country had rebuilt her instincts from the ground up. The shelter cabin came into view in the mid-afternoon light. It was still standing. That surprised her, slightly. She'd half expected it to have collapsed or been dismantled in 2 decades. But the valley's winters, which destroyed so many things, had left this particular structure intact. Someone had repaired the roof at some point, and the door had been rehung, but the walls were original. The rock face behind it was exactly as she remembered. They tied the horses under the overhang, the same overhang where Porter had stood in the storm 20 years ago. And Colton got the door open. Inside, the same cast iron stove, replaced or heavily repaired at some point, the same wooden bench, a rough table that was newer than the walls. Someone used this cabin still, periodically, for shelter on mountain trips. It was not exactly as she remembered it, which was accurate because nothing was exactly as you remembered it. Colton got the stove going. He was better at it than he'd been in 1883, faster, more efficient, fewer matches. She got water from the canteen they'd brought and set it to heat, and they moved around the small space without getting in each other's way, which was the most natural thing in the world and had once been something they'd had to learn. When the stove was going and the cabin had begun the slow process of becoming less hostile, they sat, he on the bench, she on the edge of the table, and were quiet for a while with the kind of quiet that had nothing uncomfortable in it. I've been thinking, Evelyn said, about what I would tell someone. If someone young were about to do what I did. Write letters to a stranger and cross the country? Arrive somewhere entirely new and try to build something. She looked at the stove. I've been trying to work out what the actual lesson is, not the version that sounds good. He waited. He was good at waiting. I think the thing I'd say is that courage isn't the absence of fear about the big decisions, she said. It's the willingness to show up for the small ones. Every day, the ones that don't feel like decisions at all. Whether to get up when it's cold, whether to say the honest thing, whether to stay when staying is harder than leaving would have been, she paused. Those are the decisions that build something, not the one moment of choosing to come. That was easy in comparison. Getting on a stagecoach is easy, Colton said, with the dry quality that had always been there, under the surface. Getting on the stagecoach was the beginning of the easy part, she agreed. Everything after was the actual work. He was quiet for a moment, then, I should have told you sooner that I was glad you came. She looked at him. I thought it, he said. I knew it within the first month. I didn't say it because... He stopped, started again. I didn't want you to think it was about what you were doing for the ranch, or the school, all the useful things. He looked at his hands. It wasn't about useful. She held this carefully, the way you held things that mattered. I know, she said. I know you know. He looked up. I'm saying it anyway, 20 years late. Better than 30, she said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. He'd never been a man who smiled easily. But the thing that was behind a smile, the interior version of it, which she'd learned over 2 decades to read as clearly as anyone else's open expression. Outside, the wind was building. Not the catastrophic wind of the blizzard 20 years ago, but real wind, mountain wind, the kind that reminded you that this country's indifference was not personal and also not negotiable. The stove ticked steadily. Through the small window, the light was going gold and then gray as the afternoon finished itself. Wyatt thinks we're sentimental, Evelyn said. Wyatt is wrong about that. What are we then? He thought about it. She could see him doing it, genuinely considering, not reaching for the easy answer. It was one of the things about him that had never changed. He didn't reach for easy answers. He sat with questions until he had the real one. Paying attention, he said finally, to what it actually was. So we don't let it become a story we tell about ourselves instead of a thing we lived. She looked at him for a long moment. This was more than he usually said in one piece, and she understood it had cost him something to arrange it into words, and she was not going to let it pass without acknowledgement. That's exactly right, she said. He nodded once and looked back at the stove. They ate what they'd packed, which was plain food that tasted better than it deserved to because they were cold and it was hot, and that was the whole of the calculation. They talked about practical things, James and the land management ideas he'd been reading about, Margaret's plan to go to Denver for a year to study something nobody in the family had fully pinned down yet, Wyatt's intention to expand the South pasture in spring. The ordinary substance of a family's ongoing life, discussed in the place where the life had started, which gave the ordinary substance a different quality than it had at the kitchen table at home. Neither of them said anything about the significance of it. They didn't need to. The significance was in the being there, not in the naming of it. They slept in the cabin that night. The bench for him, the table pushed against the wall with their bedrolls on it for her, because there was no cot, and the floor was too cold, and neither of them was 22 anymore, though neither of them said that last part out loud. The stove held through the night with careful management. The wind found the gaps in the walls and came through them and was endured. In the morning, Colton was awake first, which had been true every morning of their marriage. She woke to the smell of coffee made from the small tin they'd packed and the sound of the stove being fed, and lay still for a moment in the gray early light, listening to the specific sounds of him moving in a small space, and thought about the first morning she'd woken to those sounds, in this same cabin, not knowing yet what they were, not knowing yet what any of it would be. She had known very little then. She'd known she was cold, and that a man she'd only met the day before had come to find her, and that she intended to reach Hatcher's Creek regardless of what came next. She'd known she had a tendency to land on her feet, which had turned out to be mostly true with some notable exceptions, and she'd known that she was not afraid, or rather, that she had decided fear would not be the deciding factor. 20 years later, she knew her husband's silences the way she knew the weight of her own hands. She knew which fence posts on the north pasture were due for replacement, and which months the creek ran reliable, and which didn't, and what the sky looked like at 4 in the afternoon when a serious storm was 3 hours out. She knew that Wyatt kept the drawing she'd given back to him, the 3-figure pencil sketch from when he was 7, in a box in his room, and that he'd never mentioned it, and neither had she, and that this was one of the important silences between them, the kind that meant more kept than spoken. She knew that James would eventually leave ranching and do something with land in a way that hadn't been invented yet, and that this was right for him, and that Colton would have to be helped to see it when the time came. She knew that Margaret was going to be fine wherever she went, in the specific way that certain people were fine, not because the world was easy, but because they were made for the friction of it. She got up. Colton handed her coffee. She took it. They stood in the cabin doorway in the early morning cold with their cups, looking at the mountains the way people looked at things they'd learned to read without trying. The sky was clear, and the cold was serious, and the light was coming up over the eastern ridge, In the thin, hard way it came in November at elevation. "Ready?" he said. Same word, same tone, same economical use of language he'd always had. She thought about the first time he'd said it. Outside Margaret Calloway's boarding house, standing in the street with his hat in one hand, the whole uncertain beginning of things laid out in front of them both. She'd said yes then without knowing what yes would mean. She knew now. She knew in her bones and her hands, and the particular weariness and strength that 20 years of honest living left in a body. "Yes," she said. They rode home in the clear, cold morning, down through the pass, below the tree line where the timber was dark and dense and the trail was sheltered from the wind. The horses moved steadily. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much that needed saying, and they'd both long since stopped filling silence for the sake of it. At the point where the valley came into view, the smoke from the ranch's chimneys, the dark line of the road, the shapes of the outbuildings against the white landscape, Evelyn pulled her horse up for a moment and looked at it. She'd stood at this point before. Not exactly this point, not deliberately, but she'd seen this view dozens of times over the years, coming back from the east pasture or the school or town, coming back from wherever the work had taken her. She'd always registered it as the ranch. Home, the place she was returning to. This morning she registered something else alongside that. Not instead of it, alongside it. The view was the same. The ranch was the same. She was not the same woman who had first seen these mountains from a stagecoach window, which was obvious and also still sometimes surprising because the changes had happened so gradually she'd barely seen them coming. She had arrived with almost nothing: a brown leather bag, a worn copy of a novel, a photograph of a man she'd never met, and the specific stubbornness of a person who had decided that adequate was not enough. She had not known if it would work. She had not known if the man would be someone she could build a life with, or if the boy would ever trust her, or if the country would break her before she learned to read it. It had not broken her. It had worn her down in places and rebuilt those places into something harder and more useful, which was not the same as breaking. She looked at Colton, who had stopped beside her and was looking at the valley with the expression he got when he was doing the same thing she was doing, taking stock, paying attention, not letting it become a story instead of a life. He was not a man who said much. She had known this from his letters, confirmed it in the line shack, and lived with it for 20 years. He had also, in those 20 years, said enough, slowly, imperfectly, in the ways available to him, that she understood she was known by him in the way that mattered. Not the version of herself she presented to the town or even to her children. The actual version. The one that had been afraid and come anyway, that had made wrong calculations and corrected them, that had been homesick for a city she'd left deliberately and had never admitted it out loud to anyone except once to him. He'd said, "I know," and that had been enough because he did know, and knowing was what she'd wanted. She turned her horse back toward the ranch. "Let's go home," she said. He fell in beside her, and they rode down through the last stretch together, the way they'd been doing things for 20 years. Not in perfect step, not without friction, not without the ongoing ordinary difficulty of two people sharing a life in hard country, but together, choosing it each time the choice came up, which was every day, which was the whole of it. The valley came up to meet them. The smoke from the chimneys rose straight in the still morning air. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped. The ranch was already awake, already working, already moving through another day of the work that never finished. They rode in through the gate. Wyatt looked up from the corral where he was checking the fence line and raised one hand in the brief acknowledgement of a man who'd expected them and was glad they were back and saw no reason to make more of it than that. Evelyn raised her hand back. The story that newcomers told about the Mercer Ranch, the one that had become something like legend in the valley, passed from family to family over the years, carried east by travelers, and eventually circulated in the way good stories circulated, was about a rancher who rode into a blizzard to rescue a woman he'd never met. It was a good story. It was true, as far as it went. What the story left out was everything after. The cold mornings and the account books and the cattle that died in bad winters, and the fence posts and the water rights, and the boy who'd needed time, and the girl who learned to read, and the years of work that looked like nothing from outside but were, from inside, the whole of the thing. The story that mattered wasn't the rescue. The rescue had lasted 3 days. The rest had lasted 20 years and was still going, and would for as long as both of them chose to show up for it. Imperfectly, honestly, without the benefit of knowing how it would turn out. That was all it had ever been. That was everything it needed to be.